The Pope was trying to get the bishops to do something about this, but they resented the papal interference, so they weren't being very effective. So the Pope saw that what he needed was a group of people loyal to himself who could carry out this Inquisition, who could go there and see what was going on and to stamp out the heresy in southern France. And to do this, he called upon the Dominicans in the year 1231. So the real beginning of the Inquisition is the year 1231 in southern France. Pope Gregory IX calls upon the Dominicans, a recently formed order, and they only became an order, I think, in 1220. So they were a recently formed order of religious friars, and they began to carry out the Inquisition in southern France. There's the first real history of the Inquisition is written by an American author at the beginning of the 20th century. His name was Lea, L-E-A. He's quite anti-Catholic in his writings. He wrote a massive 4 or 5 volumes on this. He researched all the archives that he could find. But he says, even though he's very anti-Catholic, he says that the cause of the Inquisition was the cause of civilization and progress, because he saw from his readings that the culture, the society of southern France was being very adversely affected by these people. This Manichaean heresy, this dualist heresy was causing havoc in some ways in the society. So even though he thought the Inquisition was very wrong-headed, he nevertheless believed that the cause of the Inquisition was a good cause. So what was it? It was a papally approved institution that was charged with investigating and punishing heresy and other crimes against the faith. I'm talking here about the medieval Inquisition, and we're going to get to the Spanish Inquisition in just a few minutes. This is the less well-known one. How did it operate? They would go into a town, the inquisitors with their retinue, and there would be a time of grace. So they would basically say that they were here to investigate heresy. They would request that anyone who had any information on this come forward. Anybody who wanted to could come and confess their crime, confess their heresy. They would be forgiven, given a penance. But then someone who confessed to being a heretic had to inform on those others who were also joining him, who were also heretics. So then after that period of grace was over, then they would set up a court, and they would begin to call witnesses. And these would normally be people who had been named by other heretics. The inquisitors were not alone. The bishop was called in to take part in this, and also some of the leading men of the locality who were free of suspicion. So it was not a secret thing in that sense. It was not something that was hidden away, that the leading people of the locality could be involved in this. People who were accused were not told who their accusers were. Again, that sounds to us very, very bad, but certainly if you read the early history of the Inquisition, people would be told who their accusers were, and the next day their accusers would be dead. So it was a rather violent time. And so very quickly, the Inquisition decided to stop that and just to let them know that someone had informed against them, and they had to give their own testimony there, and they had to either confess their crime or not. Now, who were these judges? Well, they were Dominicans. They were very well educated, people who were known to lead upright lives, of course, very knowledgeable in theology and law. When somebody was found guilty of heresy, and he did not retract, then he was handed over to the secular power. So the church would say, okay, the Inquisition would say, we found this person guilty of heresy. He would be handed over to the civil courts, who would in theory try him again, but in fact they wouldn't, and he would be executed. And the penalty for this was burning at the stake. That was the penalty for treason, and so it was the penalty that the civil power, the civil courts, ordered for heretics. What about torture? Well, torture was being used in criminal procedures throughout Europe. And if there were not two witnesses, Roman law had come back in, and so if you needed two witnesses, two eyewitnesses to convict someone of a crime. If you didn't have that, you needed a confession. And so in the civil courts, then it was normal that someone who was accused, if he would not confess, he would be tortured. Now, we see this as bizarre, as terrible, and of course, there are many instances where people would confess under torture to things that they obviously didn't do, anything to stop the torture. So to us it seems like a crazy system, but it's what was used there throughout all the courts in Europe. In the year 1252 then, this is about 30 years then after, 20 years after the Inquisition starts, Pope Innocent IV, when asked about this, he wrote a document in which he said, yes, in the Inquisition, we're going to use the same procedures as are used in criminal courts. And so from that moment on, the Inquisition is allowed to use torture in examining accused people. Not witnesses, but accused people. There were strict rules surrounding it. You know, a person couldn't be mutilated. A doctor had to be present to make sure the person's life wasn't in danger, and he had to repeat his confession afterwards to the tribunal outside of the place where the torture had been applied. But nevertheless, it was, and that's something that we can't deny. References to torture, though, are very rare. If you go through the archives, from what I've read and the secondary sources that I've read, that torture was used, but it was used seldom in the Inquisition cases. It was not something, it wasn't a regular thing, and all the scholars admit this. There are very few references to it, but it clearly was used in some cases. Now, so there were some abuses, but the problem is that anti-Catholic historians have taken a few abuses and they've generalized them. So they take the abuses as the norm, they portray all the victims as innocent, all the Inquisition personnel as evil. You know, these are Gothic novels, and every step of the procedure is seen as a violation of natural law. And so you take an abuse, abuses did happen, and then you generalize those and say, well, this is what the Inquisition was. Well, it wasn't. It certainly wasn't that bad. There were abuses, and we can't deny that. The Pope himself is asking for pardon for those cases. How many heretics were actually burned by the civil authorities as a result of inquisitorial procedures in the Middle Ages? And the answer is that we don't know, because the archives, it was not a centralized office at that time. The Spanish Inquisition was, we know everything about the Spanish Inquisition. The archives have come down to us intact. We know everything about that. But the medieval Inquisition, no. Napoleon, when he sacked Rome, he scattered these documents all over Europe, and so there's no central registry. Many of them have been lost. So we don't really know how many people were executed during the medieval Inquisition, but we have some idea, and we can extrapolate from existing records. The most famous, let's say infamous, of the medieval inquisitors, his name was Bernard de Caux, C-A-U-X. He was called the Hammer of the Heretics, and he was the one who was considered to be most ferocious. He was an inquisitor for 15 years in the 13th century. He judged many thousands of people. He handed down 930 sentences. Most of them would be to prison or penances to people. And of all those people that he judged, 42 were sent to the civil authorities for execution. So the most violent, the most aggressive, and the most infamous of the inquisitorial judges of the Middle Ages sent 42 people to their death. The other one, who's well known, his name is Jacques Fournier. He was an inquisitor for 8 years. He sentenced 114 people to penalties of one sort, and of those, 5 were sentenced to death. So that gives you an idea that we're not talking here about tens of thousands of people. There were probably, there are probably hundreds, perhaps even several thousand people, though, during the Middle Ages, who were executed as a result of these heresy trials and the Inquisition.